Alrighty, welcome back to Free Read Fridays. I'm your incorrigible, incorrigible narrator, Frageth, and today we're going to read more Behemoth, Book 2, Seppuku, by Peter Watts. That sublime feeling when the streaming software you're using decides to take any and all settings that you've had and dropkick them somewhere into the sun or in its immediate orbit to burn up. Come on. Well, I kept some of the sound settings anyway. Most of those look intact. My screen layout's all screwed up though, so I am probably not going to see certain things until it is too late, because I'm going to be looking at the wrong spot. That's fine. So I can move that. Boy howdy. No, okay, we're not going to worry about that for now. Because I got better things to do. So as I had indicated last week, sorry, I had forgotten to put a link to the book itself, which is on Peter Watts' website for free. Right there. It's in the stream description. You can go there. It's got both volumes condensed into one, because that's how it's meant to be read. You can download it if you so choose, as a zipped HTML or a PDF if you want. Or just read it right there on the webpage. You can do either one. Any of those options are available to you. Okay, so what does Peter Watts have to say about this cover? Excellent question, and I'm glad you asked. Somehow, amazing. It is by Dante Fenolio from a 2014 printing. Somehow, amazingly, this French publisher managed to release the novel as a single volume without going bankrupt. I have another cover which I think I showed for the previous volume, which is something a bit more recognizable as a virus, whereas this is a jellyfish. He's jelly. He's a jelly boy. Or a jellyfish. It's a jelly. Anyway, at any rate, what do we got? What happened previously? Let's see. Lenie and Ken have both gotten to the surface. It looks like somebody has been hunting the people of Atlantis from above. Their fears are being borne out in that regard, and they were smart enough to find the recording data device that Ken Lubin had hidden there, even though it was effectively invisible, which is not a good sign. Let's see. They made a new friend with Taka Willette, who is a roving doctor, let's say, and she's got a history. Maybe we'll learn more about that history later. Possibly. Why does it keep trying to put these at the top? I don't want them at the top. They weren't at the top before. Wow. Never mind. I see how it is. I see. Oh, I see. I don't have to be happy about it, but I see. Oh, I see. At some point, I'm going to have to read aloud Cory Doctorow's treatise on the whatever. It's far enough into the stream, I can say it. The enshittification of, he calls out TikTok specifically in the title. It's called the enshittification of TikTok, but it's not just about TikTok. It's about the general trend of late-stage capitalism as it pertains to social media as well as just general services, typically digital. Steam is called out, Facebook is called out, Amazon in particular is called out, and it's the way of things. Anyway, I'll sort this thing out later. So yeah, we're a good chunk of the way in now. Book 2 is not especially long. Let's see. I've not picked out a stopping point for today, so give me a sec to find that real quick. Come on. Sorry about the late start again. Technology problems. Of course, it ends like at the most convenient possible place. Beautiful. I love it. I love it. I love it. When a plan comes together. The copy of my book is one I got from a library book sale. So if you hear a crinkling sound, it's because the cover they have on there. The quality isn't 10 out of 10, but it's a good book. So, and I was helping a local library at the time, which y'all should do if you ain't already. It's not a bad idea. I don't want anything weird to happen there. Yeah. Go away. Sorry, this is a bit more scattered than I like to be usually. And sit back, relax, and we'll get cracking. Eventually, once I find where I put my there it is. It's a tiny bookmark, but it does its job. The trigonometry of salvation. This does not parse, Lubin thought. Mid-June on the 44th parallel, 15 or 20 minutes after sunset, say about 5 degrees of planetary rotation, which would put eclipse altitude at about 33 kilometers. The missiles had dropped into shadow for 4 or 5 seconds before detonation, if this witness was to be trusted. Assuming the usual re-entry velocity of 7 kilometers per second, that put actual detonation at an altitude no greater than 5,000 meters, probably much lower. She'd reported an airburst, not an impact and not a fireball. Fireworks, she'd called them, and always at twilight or during darkness. The sun was just clearing the ridge to the east when he arrived at the back door of Penobscot Power's abandoned enterprise. Focina, Focina and the doctor's MI had coexisted briefly in the bowels of those remains. Her service tunnel had run along the spine of a great subterranean finger of ocean, 60 meters wide and 100 times as long, drilled through solid bedrock. At the time of its conception, it had been a valiant recreation of the lunar engine that drove the tides of Fundy, 200 clicks up the coast. Now it was only a great flooded sewer pipe, and a way for shy submarines to slip inland unobserved. None of which was obvious from here, of course. From here there was only a scorched chain-link fence, carbon-coated rectangles of metal that had once proclaimed "No trespassing," and, 50 meters on the other side, where the rock rose from the earth, a broken-toothed concrete and rebar mouth in the face of the ridge. One of the gate's two panels swung creaking in the arid breeze. The other listed at an angle, stiff in its hinges. He stood with his back to the gate. He raised his arm and held it. He remembered where the doctor had pointed, corrected his angle. That way. Just a few degrees over the horizon. That implied either a high distance sighting or a much closer, low altitude one. Atmospheric inversions were strongest during twilight and darkness, Lubin remembered. They were generally only a few hundred meters thick, and they tended to act as a blanket, holding released particulates close to the ground. He walked south. Flames still flickered here and there, consuming little pockets of leftover combustibles. A morning breeze was rising, coming in from the coast. It promised cooler temperatures and cleaner air. Now, though, ash still gusted everywhere. Lubin coughed up chalky phlegm and kept going. The doctor had given him a belt to go with the grenades. The little aerosol explosives bumped against his hips as he walked. He kept the gun in hand, aiming absently at convenient targets, stumps and powdered shrubs and the remains of fence posts. There wasn't much to point at. His imagination invested what there was with limbs and faces. He imagined them bleeding. Of course, his witness had hardly been a GPS on legs. There were so many errors nested in her directions that correcting for wind speed was tantamount to adding one small error to a half-dozen larger ones. Still, Lubin was nothing if not systematic. There was a reasonable chance that he was within a kilometer of the starburst's coordinates. He turned east for a few minutes to compensate for the breeze. Then he popped the first grenade onto his pistol and fired at the sky. It soared into the air like a great yellow egg and exploded into a fluorescent pink cloud 20 meters across. He watched it dissipate. The first tatters followed the the first tatters followed the prevailing winds, tugging the cloud into an ovoid, delicate cotton candy streamers drifting from its downstream end. Let's try that sentence again. Enough commas? He watched it dissipate. The first tatters followed the prevailing winds, tugging the cloud into an ovoid, delicate cotton candy streamers drifting from its downstream end. After a few moments, though, it began to disperse laterally as well, its component particles instinctively sniffing the air for signs of treasure. No obvious movement against the wind. That would have been too much to hope for this early in the game. He fired the next grenade 100 meters diagonally upwind of the first, the third 100 meters from each of the others, the closing point of a roughly equilateral triangle. He zigzagged his way across the wasted landscape, kicking little drifts of ash where bracken and shrubbery had clustered a day earlier, navigating endless rocky moguls and fissures. Once he even hopped across a scorched stream bed, still trickling, fed by some miraculous source farther upstream than the flamethrowers had reached. At rough, regular intervals, he shot another absurd pink cloud into the sky, and watched it spread, and moved on. He was aiming his 8th grenade when he noticed the residue of the 7th behaving strangely. It had started as puffy round cumulus, like all the others. Now, though, it was streaked and streaming, as though being stretched by the wind, which would indeed have been the case if it had been streaming with the breeze instead of across it. And another cloud, more distant and dissipated, seemed to be breaking the same rules. They didn't flow, these aerosol streams, not to the naked eye. Rather, they seemed to drift against the wind, toward some point of convergence back the way Lubin had come, about 30 degrees off his own track. And they were losing altitude. He started after them. The motes in those clouds couldn't be called intelligent by any stretch of the word, but they knew what they liked, and they had the means to get it. to get to it. They were olfactory creatures, and they loved the smell of two things above all else. The first was the protein signatures put out by a wide array of weaponized biosols. They tracked that aroma like sharks sniffing blood in the water, and when they finally found that ambrosia and rolled around in it, they changed chemically. That was the other thing these creatures loved, the smell of their own kind fulfilled. It was the classic biomagnifying 1-2 punch. Too often, traces of one's quarry were too faint to do more than whisper to a few passing motes. Those would lock on, enzyme to substrate, and achieve their own personal nirvana. But that very merger would quench the emissions that had lured them in the first place. The contaminant would be flagged, but the flag would be far too small to catch any mammalian eye. But to be aroused not only by prey, but by others similarly aroused, why, it scarcely mattered whether there was enough to go around. A single offending particle would be enough to start an orgiastic fission reaction. Each subsequent arrival would only brighten the collective signal. Lubin found it half buried in the gravel bed of a shallow gully. It looked like a snub-nosed bullet 30 centimeters long, perforated by rows of circular holes along half its length. It looked like the salt shaker of a giant with pathologically high blood pressure. It looked like the business end of a multi-headed suborbital device for the delivery of biological aerosols. Lubin couldn't tell what color it had originally been. It was dripping with fluorescent pink goo. Willette's MI changed before his eyes on the final steps of his approach. Bright holographic phantoms resolved within the vehicle. The plastic skin grew translucent, exposing neon guts and nerves beneath. Lubin was getting used to such visions. His new inlays served up the diagnostic emissions of any unshielded machinery within a 12-meter radius. This particular vehicle wasn't quite as forthcoming as he would have liked, though. It was riddled with tumors, rectangular shadows beneath the dark swaths across. Nope, that's a comma. Frag knows how to read, he promises. Honestly, the formatting on this is kind of brutal because the lines are pretty short. So there's a lot of line breaks. His new inlays. This particular vehicle wasn't quite as forthcoming as he would have liked, though. It was riddled with tumors, rectangular shadows beneath the dash, dark swaths across the passenger door, a black, unreflective cylinder rising through the center of the vehicle like a dark heart. The MI had a lot of security, all of it shielded. Clarke and Willette stood to one side, watching him approach. Willette was nothing special to Lubin's new eyes. Dim sparkles glimmered from within Clarke's thorax, but they told him nothing. Inlays and implants spoke different dialects. There we go. Emphasis on the right syllable. He toggled the inlays. The hallucinatory schematics imploded, leaving dull plastic and white dust and non-luminous flesh and clothing behind. "You found something," Willette said. "We saw the clouds." He told them. Willette stared, open-mouthed. "They're shooting germs at us? We're already on our last legs! Why bother hitting us with megapox or supercall when we're already—" She stopped. The outrage on her face gave way to a puzzled frown. Clarke looked the question over the doctor's confusion. "Betamax?" Lubin shrugged. "Perhaps Enum isn't dying fast enough. A significant number of M&Ms regard Behemoth as divine retribution for North America's sins. It's official policy in Italy and Libya, at least. Botswana, too, I believe." Clarke snorted. "North America's sins? They think it just stops at the Atlantic?" "The moderates think they can keep it at bay,"
Willette said. The extremists don't want to. They don't get into paradise until the world ends. Her mind seemed elsewhere. She spoke as if absently flicking at some hovering insect. Lubin let her think. She was, after all, the closest available approximation to a native guide. Perhaps she could come up with something. Who are you people? Willette asked quietly.
Excuse me?
You're not feral. You're not clave. You sure as hell aren't Xera, or you'd be better equipped. Maybe you're Transat, but that doesn't fit either. A faint smile passed across her face. You don't know what you're doing, do you? You're making it up as you go along. Lubin kept his face neutral and his question on target.
Is there any reason not to believe that people might launch a biological attack against North America simply to hasten things along?
She seemed to find this amusing. You don't get out much, do you?
Am I wrong?
You're not wrong. Willette spat on the ashy ground. Lots of folks might help Providence along if they had the chance. That doesn't mean this was an attack.
What else would it be?
Maybe it's a counteragent. Clarke looked up at that. A cure? Not so personal, maybe. Something that kills Behemoth in the wild. Lubin eyed Willette. I'm mispronouncing that. Oulette. Oulette? I should find out how that's pronounced. Ouellette. I believe it's Oulette. She answered his unspoken skepticism. Of course, there are crazies out there who want the world to end, but there have to be a lot more people who don't, wouldn't you agree? And they'd be working just as hard. There was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. They almost shone.
He nodded. But if this is a counteragent, why do you suppose they tried to shoot it down? And why deliver it suborbitally? Wouldn't it be more efficient to leave the deployment to the local authorities?
Oulette rolled her eyes. What local authorities? Clarke frowned. Wouldn't someone have told everybody? Wouldn't someone have told you? Laurie, you make something like this too public, and you're painting a bullseye on your chest for the M&Ms. As for missile defense, Oulette turned back to Lubin. Did the people on your planet ever mention something called the Rio Insurrection?
Tell us about it, Lubin said, thinking, Laurie?
I can't, really, Oulette admitted. Nobody really knows what happened. They say maybe a bunch of Madonnas got into Xera's Rio de Janeiro offices and went crazy. Launched attacks all over the place.
Who won?
The good guys. At least Rio got vaporized and the trouble stopped, but who knows? Some people say it wasn't Lenie's at all. It was some kind of civil war between rogue lawbreakers. But whatever it was way out there. She waved a hand at the horizon. We had our own problems to deal with, and the only real moral of the story is nobody knows who's running things anymore, or whose side they're on, and we're all too busy hanging on by our fingernails to afford the time for any big questions. For all we know, Ennem's Battleites are running on autopilot, and ground control just lost the access codes. Or the Lennies are having a little target practice. Or maybe the M&Ms have someone on the inside. The fact that something's shooting at these bugs doesn't prove anything one way or the other.
Lubin focused on that. No proof.
So I'm going to get some. I'm going to sequence the bug. Now, are you going to let me drive back to the scene, or am I going to have to walk?
Lubin said nothing. From the corner of his eye, he saw Clarke open her mouth and close it again.
Fine.
Oulette proceeded to the back of her van and opened the access panel. Lubin let her Lubin let her extract a Sterirap cartridge and a collapsible stretcher with ground effector coils built into the frame.
She looked at him calmly. It'll fit on this?
He nodded.
Clarke held the folded device against Ouellette's back, while the doctor cinched the shoulder straps. Ouellette nodded cursory thanks and started down the road, not looking back. "You think she's wrong," Clarke said as the other woman dwindled, shimmering in the rising heat.
I don't know.
"What if she isn't?"
It doesn't matter.
"It doesn't matter." Clarke shook her head, almost amused. "Ken, are you crazy?"
Lubin shrugged. If she can get a usable sample, we'll know whether it's Beta Max. Either way, we can drive to Bangor and use her credentials to get inside. After that, it should be...
"Ken, did you even hear what she just said? There could be a fix for Behemoth." He sighed.
This is exactly why I didn't want you coming, he said at last. You've got your own agenda, and it's not what we're here for. You get distracted.
"Distracted?" She shook her head, astonished. "I'm talking about saving the world, Ken. I don't think I'm distracted at all."
No, you don't. You think you're damned.
Instantly, something in her shut down. He pushed on anyway.
I don't agree, for what it's worth.
"Really?" Clarke's face was an expressionless mask.
I'd say you're only obsessed, which is still problematic.
"Go on."
You think you destroyed the world. Lubin looked around at the scorched landscape. You think this is all your fault. You give up the mission, your life, mine, You'd give up the mission, your life, mine, in an instant, just so long as you saw the slightest chance of salvation. You're so sick of the blood on your hands, you'd barely notice that you were washing it off with even more.
"Is that what you think?" He looked at her.
Is there anything you wouldn't do, then, for the chance to take it all back?
She held his gaze for long seconds. Finally, she looked away.
Lubin nodded. You've personalized the greater good in a way I've never seen in a baseline human before. I wonder if your brain hasn't concocted its own form of guilt trip.
She stared at the ground. "It doesn't change anything," she whispered at last, "even if my motives are personal."
It's not your motives that worry me. It's your judgment.
"We're still talking about saving the world."
No, he said. We're talking about someone else trying to. Possibly. We're talking about an entire country or consortium far better equipped and better informed than two hitchhikers from the mid-Atlantic ridge. And, holding up his hand against her protest, we are also talking about other powerful forces who may be trying to stop them, for reasons we can only guess at. Or perhaps for no reason at all, if Ouellette's speculations are correct. We're not players in this, no matter how desperately you wish we were.
"We've always been players, Ken. We've just been too scared to make a move for the past 5 years."
And things have changed during that time.
She shook her head. "We have to try."
We don't even know the rules anymore. And what about the things we can change? What about Atlantis? What about the Rifters? What about Alex? Do you really want to throw away any chance of helping them in favor of a lost cause?
He knew the instant he said it that he'd miscalculated. Something flared in her, something icy and familiar and utterly unswayable. "How dare you?" she hissed. "You never gave a shit about Alex or Grace or even me, for that matter. You were ready to kill us all. You switched sides every time the odds changed." Clarke shook her head in disgust. "How dare you talk about loyalty and saving lives? You don't even know what that means unless someone feeds it to you as a mission parameter." He should have known it would be no use arguing with her. She wasn't interested in assessing the odds of success. She wasn't even balancing payoffs, weighing Atlantis against the rest of the world. The only variables she cared about came from inside her own head, and neither guilt nor obsession were amenable to cost-benefit analysis. Even so, her words provoked a strange feeling in his throat.
Lenie, I didn't mean...
She held up her hand and refused to meet his eyes. He waited. Maybe it's not even your fault, she said after a while. They just built you that way.
He allowed himself the curiosity. What way?
You're an army ant. You just bull ahead with your feelers on the ground, following your orders and your mission profiles and your short-term objectives, and it never even occurs to you to look up and see the big picture.
I see it, Lubin admitted softly. It's very much bigger than you seem willing to admit.
She shook her head, still not looking at him. He tried again.
Very well. You know the big picture. What do you suggest we do with that information? Can you offer anything beyond wishful thinking? Do you have any kind of strategy for saving the world, as you put it?
I do, said Taka Willett.
They turned.
She stood back beside the MI, arms folded. Her stretcher was nowhere in evidence.
Lubin blinked in astonishment.
Your sample... From that warhead you found? Not a chance. The tracers would have metabolized any active agent down to the atoms. Clarke shot him a look, clear as binary, even through the frosting on her eyes. Not quite on your game, super spy? Letting some dick-ass country doctor sneak up on you? But I know how we can get a sample, Willett continued, looking straight at Clarke, and I could use your help.
Welcome, welcome, welcome back to the program, Warren Steele. Thanks for tuning in. Migration. Obviously, she had come late to the conversation. If she had heard the way it started, Clarke knew, Taka Willett wouldn't have wanted anything to do with her. The good doctor had contacts on the ground, so she said. People she'd saved or bought time for. The loved ones of those whose suffering she'd ended. Occasional dealers, wildland hustlers who could sometimes conjure up drugs or spare parts to be weighed against other items in trade. They were the furthest thing from altruists, but they could be lifesavers when the closest resupply lifter was a week away. All of them had a healthy sense of self-interest. All of them knew others. Lubin remained skeptical, of course. Or at least, Clarke thought, he continued to act skeptical. It was part of his shtick. It had to be. Nobody would honestly turn their back on the chance, however faint, to undo even a part of what I set in motion. There was the rub, and Lubin, God damn him, knew it as well as she did. Once you've helped destroy the world, once you've taken fierce, stinging pleasure in its death throes, it's not easy to claim the moral high ground over someone who's merely reluctant to save it. Even if it's been a while, even if you've changed in the meantime. If there's a statute of limitations on terracide, there's no way it expires after a lousy 5 years. Taka Willett had proposed a southern course toward whatever was left of Portland, and even if there was no way into the data pipe from there, Boston would be that much closer. Besides, Willett was an official person in these parts, someone with recognized credentials and identity, almost an authority figure by local standards. She might even be able to walk them in through the front door.
Authority figures don't drive around handing out derms from the back of a truck, Lubin said.
Yeah, and what have your efforts netted us lately? You still think you can hack into the global nervous system when all the backdoor nerves have been burned away? In the end, he agreed, with conditions. They would go along with Willett's plan so long as it took them in the right direction. They would make use of her MI after every counter-intrusion device had been ripped out of the cab. He would ensure her cooperation while she advised Clarke on the necessary monkey work. The MI's cab was a marvel of spatial economy. Twin cots folded down in the space behind the seats, and a little shower/head cubicle squeezed into the rear wall between a Calvin cycler and the forward medical interface. But what really amazed Clarke was the number of booby traps infesting the place.
There were gas canisters hooked into the ventilation system. There were taser needles sheathed in the seat cushions, ready to shoot through flesh and insulative clothing at a word or a touch. There was a photic driver under the dash, a directional infrared strobe that could penetrate closed eyelids and induce seizures. Blah. Taka Willette itemized them all, Lubin standing at her back, while Clarke scrambled about with a toolkit and pulled the plugs.
Clarke had no way of knowing if the list was comprehensive. For all she knew, Willette was leaving an ace up her sleeve against future necessity. But Lubin was a lot less trusting than she was, and Lubin seemed satisfied.
It took them an hour to disarm the cab. After Willette, after, oh no, 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 page break's getting the better of me. After Willette asked if they wanted to disable external security as well, she actually seemed disappointed when Lubin shook his head. They split up. Lubin would pilot Facina down the coast and try to access Portland independently. Clarke, keeping a copy of the Betamax sequence close to her chest, would accompany Willette toward a rendezvous near one of her regular waypoints.
Don't tell her about Betamax before you have to, Lubin warned, safely out of Willette's earshot.
Why not?
Because it defeats the only defense anyone's ever been able to muster against Behemoth. The moment she realizes something like that exists, her priorities are going to turn upside down.
Clarke was initially surprised that Lubin would let either of them out of his sight. He wasn't fond of potential security breaches, even without his kill reflex engaged, and he knew Clarke was chafing against his mission priorities. He wasn't a trusting soul at the best of times. How did he know that the two women wouldn't simply turn inland and abandon him altogether? It was only when they'd gone their separate ways that the obvious answer occurred to her. Of course, he'd been hoping for that very thing. They drove through a land blasted and scoured clean of any live thing. The MI, built for rough terrain, climbed over fallen tree trunks that crumbled beneath its wheels. It navigated potholes filled with ash and soot, drove straightaways where swirls and gusts of gray powder swept across the reef-frozen asphalt like tiny Antarctic blizzards, centimeters high. Twice they passed deranged billboards half melted against the rock, their lattices warped and defiantly semi-functional, advertising nothing now but the flickering multicolored contours of their own heat stress. After a while it began to rain. The ash congealed like paste on the ground, stuck to the hood like blobs of paper mache. Some of those blobs were almost heavy enough to thwart the windshield, leaving light smudges on the glass before the static field bounced them away. They didn't exchange a word during that whole time. Unfamiliar music filled the silence between them, archaic compositions full of clonking pianos and nervous strings. Willette seemed to like it anyway. She focused on driving. Willette seemed to like it anyway. She focused on driving while Clarke stared out the window, reflecting on the allocation of damage. How much of this devastation could be laid at her door? How much at the doors of demons who'd adopted her name? Eventually, they left the scorched zone behind. Now there was real grass at the side of the road, occasional shrubs pocking the ditches farther back, real evergreens looming like ranks of ragged, starving stickmen on the other side. Mostly brown, of course, or turning brown, as though in the grip of a great endless drought. This rain wouldn't help them. They were hanging on. Some even flew flags of hardy, defiant green from their limbs. But Behemoth was everywhere, and it was implacable, and it had all the time in the world. Sometimes it massed so abundantly that it was visible to the naked eye, patches of ochre mold smothering the grass, or spreading across the trunks of trees.
And yet, the sight of all this vegetation, not truly alive perhaps, but at least physically intact, seemed cause for some small celebration after the charnel house they'd just escaped. So, do you ever take those out? Willette wondered. Sorry? Clarke brought herself back to the moment. The doctor had gone to autopilot, a simple follow-the-road mode, with no dangerous navigational forays into GPS. Those caps on your eyes, do you ever... Oh, no, not usually. Nightshades? Let you see in the dark? Sort of. Willette pursed her lips. I remember seeing those years ago, all over the place, just before everything went bad. They were really popular for about 20 minutes. They still are from where I come from. They still are where I come from. Clarke looked out the rain-spattered side window. With my tribe, anyway. Tribe? You're not all the way from Africa. Clarke snorted softly. Fuck no. Didn't think so. You don't have the melanin, not that that means much of these days, of course. And the Tutsis wouldn't be over here anyway, except maybe to gloat. Gloat? Not that you can blame them, mind you. There's barely anyone left over there more than 40 years old. Fire Witch is pure poetic justice as far as they're concerned. Clarke shrugged. So, if not Africa, Willette said, pushing it, maybe you're from Mars. Why would you say that? You're definitely not from around here. You thought Miri was an ambulance. She patted the dashboard affectionately. You don't know about the Lenies. Clarke clenched her teeth, suddenly angry. I know about them. Nasty evolving code that lives in the maelstrom and raises shit. Vengeance icon for a bunch of countries that hate your guts. And while we're on the subject, maybe you could explain how you came to be blundering around handing out derms and mercy kills while the whole Eastern Hemisphere is trying to lob a cure for Behemoth onto your head. Not being from Mars doesn't seem to have kept you all that up to speed on current events. Willette watched her curiously for a moment. There you go again. What? Maelstrom. It's been years since I heard anyone use that word. So what? What difference does it make? Come on, Laurie. You show up in the middle of nowhere, you hijack my van. Neither of you is normal by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, of course I want to know where you came from. Clarke's anger faded as suddenly as it had flared. Sorry. In fact, given that I still seem to be some kind of honorary prisoner, you could even say you owe me an explanation. We were hiding, Clarke blurted out. Hiding? Willette didn't seem surprised. Where is there to hide? Nowhere, as it turns out. So here we are. Are you a corpse? Willette asked. Do I look like one? You look like some kind of deep-sea diver. She gestured at the vent on Clarke's chest. Electrolysis intake, right? Clarke nodded. So I guess you've been underwater all this time. Huh. Willette shook her head. I'd have guessed geosync myself. Why? It was just one of the rumors going around. Back when the witch was just getting started and the riots were taking off, this thread started growing that a few hundred high-powered corpses had vanished off the face of the earth. I don't know how you'd ever prove something like that. Nobody ever saw those people in the flesh anyway. They could have all been Sims for all we knew. Anyway, you know how these things get around. The word was they'd all jumped off-world from Australia, and they were all nice and comfy up in geosync watching the world come down. I'm not a corpse, Clarke said. But you work for them, Willette guessed. Who didn't? I mean, recently. Recently? Clarke shook her head. I think I can honestly say that neither Ken or I... Christ! It jumped out from some hiding place under the dash, all segments and clicking mandibles. It clung to her knee with far too many jointed limbs, a grotesque hybrid of grasshopper and centipede the size of her little finger. Her hand came down of its own accord. The little creature splattered under her palm. Fuck, she breathed. What was that? Whatever it wasn't doing you any harm. I've never seen anything like... Clarke broke off, looked at the other woman. Willette actually looked pissed. That wasn't... that wasn't a pet or anything, was it? It seemed absurd. Then again, it wouldn't be any crazier than keeping a head cheese. I wonder how she's doing. It was just a bug, Willette said. It wasn't hurting anybody. Clarke wiped her palm against her thigh. Chitin and yellow goop smeared across the dive skin. That was wrong. That wasn't like any bug I've ever seen. I keep telling you, you're behind the times. So these things are old news? Willette shrugged, her irritation apparently subsiding. They're starting to show up here and there. Basically, regular bugs with too many segments. Some kind of Hox mutation, I'd guess, but I don't know if anybody's looked at them all that closely. Clarke looked at the sodden, withering landscape scrolling past the window. You seem pretty invested in a bug. What, things aren't dying fast enough for you? You have to help them along? Willette took a breath, started over. Sorry, you're right. You kind of empathize with things after a while, you know? Spend enough time out here, everything seems valuable. Clarke didn't answer. The vehicle navigated a fissure in the road, wobbling on its ground effect shocks. I know it doesn't make much sense, Willette admitted after a while. It's not like Behemoth changed much of anything. What? Look out the window, Tack. Everything's dying. That was happening anyway. Not as fast, maybe. Huh. Clarke regarded the other woman. And you really think someone's throwing a cure over the transom? For humanity's stupidity? No such thing, I suspect. But for Behemoth? Who knows? How would that work? I mean, what haven't they already tried? Willette shook her head, laughing softly. Laurie, you give me way too much credit. I don't have a clue. She thought a moment. Could be a silverback solution, I suppose. Never heard of it. Few decades ago, in Africa, hardly any gorillas left, and the natives were eating up the few that remained. So some conservation group got the bright idea of making the gorillas inedible. Yeah? How? Engineered Ebola variant. Didn't harm the gorillas, but any human who ate one would bleed out inside 72 hours. Clarke smiled, faintly impressed. Would that work for us? It'd be tough. Germs evolve countermeasures a lot faster than mammals. I guess it didn't work for the gorillas either. Willette snorted. It worked way too well. So how come they're extinct? We wiped them out. Unacceptable risk to human health. Big grim zing. Rain pelted against the roof of the cab and streaked along the side windows. Up front, the drops hurtled at the windshield and veered impossibly off target, centimeters from impact. Taka, Clarke said after a few minutes. Willette looked at her. Why don't people call it the maelstrom anymore? The doctor smiled faintly. You do know why they called it that in the first place, right? It got crowded. User storms, e-life. Willette nodded. Most of that's gone now. So much of the actual network has degraded, physically, that most of the wildlife went extinct from habitat loss. This side of the wall, anyway. They partitioned EnumNet off years ago. But for all I know, it's still boiling along everywhere else. But around here, she looked out the window. Here, the maelstrom just moved outside. Oh, shit, I was not looking forward to this particular part of the book. Here we go.
So I didn't put in the warning about certain characters being pretty unpleasant. We're about to have some unpleasantness. Karma. Achilles Desjardins woke to the sound of a scream. It had died by the time he was fully awake. He lay in the darkness and wondered for a moment if he had dreamed it. There had been a time, not so long ago, when his sleep had been filled with screams. He wondered if perhaps the scream had been his, if he had awakened himself. But again, that hadn't happened in years. Not since he'd become a new man. Or rather, not since Alice had let the old one out of the cellar. Awake, alert, he knew the truth. The scream had not risen from his mind or his throat. It had risen from machinery. An alarm raised in one instant and cut off the next. Odd. He brought up his inlays. Outside his skull, the darkness persisted. Inside, a half-dozen bright windows opened in his occipital cortex. He scrolled through the major feeds, then the minor ones. He sought threats from the other side of the world, from orbit, from any foolhardy civilian who might have blundered against the fence that guarded his perimeter. He checked the impoverished cluster of rooms and hallways that his skeletal day staff had access to, although it was barely 0400 and none of them would be in so early. Nothing in the lobby, the welcome center, the kennels. Loading bays and the physical plant were nominal. No incoming missiles. Not so much as a plugged sewer line. He had heard something, though. He was sure of that. And he was sure of something else, too. He had never heard this particular alarm before. After all these years, the machines that surrounded him had become more than tools. They were friends, protectors, advisors, and trusted servants. He knew their voices intimately. The soft beeping of his inlays, the reassuring hum of building security, the subtle, multi-octave harmonics of the threat stack. This alarm hadn't come from any of them. Desjardins threw back the sheet and rose from his pallet. Stonehenge loomed a few meters away, a rough horseshoe of workstations and tactical boards glowing dimly in the darkness. Desjardins had a more official workspace, many floors above. He had official live-in quarters, too, not luxurious, but far more comfortable than the mattress he'd dragged down here. He still used those accommodations now and then, for official business or other occasions when appearances mattered. But this was the place he preferred. Secret, safe, an improvised nerve center rising from a gnarled convergence of fiber optic roots growing in from the walls. This was his throne room, and his keep, and his bunker. He knew how absurd that was, given the scope of his powers, the strength of his fortifications. But it was here, in the windowless subterranean dark, where he felt safest. Scratching himself, he plumped down onto the chair in the center of Stonehenge and began scanning the hardline intel. The world was full of yellow and red icons, as always, but nothing acute. Certainly nothing to warrant an audible alert. Desjardins dumped everything into a single events list and sorted on time. Whatever had just happened. He scrolled down the list. Caesar meltdown in Louisville. Static field failure in Boulder. Minor progress re-establishing his surveillance links down the Panhandle. More chatter about mutant bugs and weeds spreading up from the Panama line. Something touched him, lightly, on the leg. He looked down. Mandelbrot stared up at him with one eye. The other was gone, a dark, sticky hole in a face torn half away. Her flank was slick and black in the gloomy half-light. Viscera glistened through matted fur. The cat swayed drunkenly, her forepaw still upraised. She opened her mouth. With a silent meow, she toppled. Oh, God, no. Oh, please, God, no. He made the call even before bringing up the lights. Mandelbrot lay bleeding,
into a puddle of her own insides. "Oh, Jesus, please, she's dying. Don't let her die." "Hi," the tack board chirped. "This is Trev Sawyer." The fuck it was. It was an interactive, and Desjardins didn't have time to waste dicking around with dialogue trees. He killed the call and accessed the local directory. My vet, home number, kill any overrides. Somewhere in Sudbury, Sawyer's watch started ringing. "You got into the kennel again, didn't you?" Mandelbrot lay on her side, chest heaving. "Stupid cat, you could never resist taunting those monsters. You just figured, oh God, it's amazing you even made it back. Don't die. Please don't die." Sawyer wasn't answering. "Answer your watch, you stump fucking idiot. This is an emergency. Where the fuck can you be at 4 a.m.? Mandelbrot's paws twitched and flexed as if dreaming, as if electrified. Desjardins wanted to reach out, to staunch the flow or straighten the spine, or just pet her, for Christ's sakes, offer whatever pitiful comfort he could. But he was terrified that any inexpert touch might just make things worse. "It's my fault. It's my fault. I should have scaled back your clearance. You're just a cat, after all. You don't know any better. And I never even bothered to learn what your alarm sounded like. It just never occurred to me that I wouldn't—" Not a dream. Not a World Watch alert. Just a veterinary implant talking to his wristwatch. A brief scream as Mandelbrot's vitals lurched into the red. Then silence as teeth or claws or sheer shocking inertia reduced signal to noise. "Hello?" muttered a sleepy voice in midair. Desjardins' head snapped up. "This is Achilles Desjardins. My cat's been mauled by—" "What?" Sawyer said thickly. "You have any idea what time it is?" I'm sorry, I know, but this is an emergency. My cat's... Oh, God, she's torn apart. She's barely alive. You've got to..." "Your cat," Sawyer repeated. "And why are you telling me?" "You're Mandelbrot's vet. You..." The voice was icy. "I haven't been anyone's veterinarian in over 3 years." Desjardins remembered. Ennem's vets had all been conscripted into human service when Behemoth and the 1,000 opportunistic bugs riding its coattails had overwhelmed the healthcare system. "But you're still... you still know what to..." "Mr. Desjardins, forget the hour. Do you even know what year it is?" Desjardins shook his head. "What are you talking about? My cat's lying on the floor with her—" "It's 5 years after the dawn of the Fire Witch era," Sawyer continued in a cold voice. "People are dying, Mr. Desjardins, by the millions. Every day. To even waste food on a mere animal, under these circumstances, is scandalous. To expect me to spend time and resources saving an injured cat is nothing short of obscene." Desjardins' eyes stung. His vision blurred. "Please, I can help you. I can. I'll get your cycler rations doubled. I can get you unlimited water. I can get you into fucking geosync if that's what you want. You and your family. Anything. Just name it." "Very well. Stop wasting my time." "Do you even know who I am?" Desjardins cried. "I certainly do, and I'm astonished that any lawbreaker, let alone one of your evident stature, would have such completely misplaced priorities. Aren't you supposed to be immune to this sort of thing? Please." "Good night, Mr. Desjardins." "Disconnect," added a little icon in a corner of one screen. Blood bubbled at the corner of Mandelbrot's mouth. Her inner lid slid halfway across that one bloodied eyeball and retracted. "Please," Desjardins whimpered. "I don't know what to—" "Yes, you do." He bent over her, reached out a hand, pushed tentatively at a bulging loop of intestine. A spasm shuddered through Mandelbrot like a passing spirit. She meowed faintly. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." "You know what to do." He remembered Mandelbrot latching on and biting his father's ankle when the old man had come by to visit back in '48. He remembered Ken Lubin standing in Desjardins' bathroom in his underpants, scrubbing his trousers in the sink.
"Your cat pissed on me," he'd said, a hint of grudging respect in his voice.
He remembered 1,000 nights pinned on his bed, bladder full to bursting, but unwilling to disturb the furry, sleeping lump on his chest. You know. He remembered Alice showing up at work, her lacerated hands struggling to hang on to a scrawny, hissing kitten that wasn't taking any shit from anybody. "Hey, Killjoy, want a watch cat? Chaos-made flesh she is. Reversible ears, needs no batteries, guaranteed not to let anyone past your front door with all their body parts." You know. Mandelbrot convulsed again. He knew. There was nothing nearby he could use. No injectables, no gas, no projectiles. All of that stuff was loaded into the booby traps and would take far too long to extract. The room was a stripped-down shell of bone-gray walls and fiber-optic vines. The neuroinduction field would hurt. Just a fucking brick, he thought, swallowing against the grief in his throat. Just a rock. They're all over the place outside. No time. Mandelbrot wasn't even living anymore. She hadn't been living since she'd started back from the kennels. All she was doing was suffering, and all Desjardins could do was end that. He raised his foot over her head. "You and me, Bratwurst," he whispered. "We had higher clearance than anyone inside 1,000 clicks." Mandelbrot purred once. Something sagged in her as she left. Whatever remained lolled bonelessly on the floor. Desjardins kept his foot raised a moment, just in case. Finally, he brought it back to the concrete floor. Mandelbrot had never been one to yield the initiative. "Thank you," whispered Achilles Desjardins, and wept at her side.
Give me a sec.
What is it with these emotional moving moments in books that Frag is reading? Dr. Trevor Sawyer woke for the second time in as many hours. A dark shape hung over his head like a great fist. It hissed softly, a hovering reptile. He tried to rise. He couldn't. His arms and legs wobbled like unresponsive rubber. His face tingled, his jaw hung slack as cooked pasta. Even his tongue felt swollen and flaccid, sagging loose and immovable in his mouth. He stared up at the ovoid shape above the bed. It was a great dark Easter egg hanging in the air, half as long as he was, and wider. Its belly was disfigured by ports and blisters, barely discernible, reflecting slivers of gray half-light from the hallway. The hissing subsided. Sawyer felt a trickle of drool worm onto his cheek from the corner of his mouth. He tried to swallow and failed. He was still breathing. That was something. The Easter egg clicked softly. A faint, almost subsonic hum emanated from somewhere nearby. Either a ground effect field or the static of nerves misfiring in his own cochleae. It couldn't be neuroinduction. A botfly would never even get off the ground carrying coils that heavy. Neuromuscular lock of some kind, he realized. It gassed me. It gassed us. He willed his head to turn. It lay like a 10-kilogram rock on the pillow, defying him. He couldn't move his eyes. He couldn't even blink. He could hear Sandra beside him, though, breathing fast and shallow. She, too, was awake. "Went right back to sleep, I see," the botfly remarked in a familiar voice. "Didn't lose a wink over it, did you?" "Desjardins? It's okay, though," the machine went on. "Turns out you were right. Here, let me give you a hand." The botfly tilted nose down and descended until it was literally nuzzling Sawyer's cheek. It nosed him gently, like a hungry pet pestering its master for food. Sawyer's head lolled sideways on the pillow, stared past the edge of the bed and to the crib against the far wall, barely visible in the gloom. Oh God, what? This couldn't be happening. Achilles Desjardins was a lawbreaker, and lawbreakers, they simply didn't do this sort of thing. They couldn't. Nobody had ever admitted it officially, of course, but Sawyer was connected. He knew the scoop. There were restraints right down at the biochemical level to keep lawbreakers from misusing their power, to keep them from doing exactly what. The robot floated across the bedroom. It came to rest about a meter over the crib. The thin crescent of a rotating lens glinted on its belly, focusing. "Kayla, isn't it?" the botfly murmured. "7 months, 3 days, 14 hours. I say, Dr. Sawyer, your genes must be very special to justify bringing a child into such a shitty world. I bet it pissed off the neighbors something awful. How'd you get around the pop control statutes?"
Please, Sawyer thought, don't hurt her. I'm sorry. I.
I bet you cheated, the machine mused. I bet this pissy little larva shouldn't even be here. Ah, well, like I said before, you were right about real people. They really do die all the time.
Please, oh dear God, give me strength. Let me move. At least give me strength enough to beg.
Bright as the sun, a fiery proboscis licked down through the darkness and set Kayla alight. The botfly turned and regarded Trevor Sawyer through a dark cyclopean eye, while his child screamed and blackened. "Why, there goes one now," it remarked. "For Mandelbrot," Desjardins whispered, "in memory." He freed the botfly to return to its appointed rounds. It would not be able to answer any of the inevitable questions resulting from this night, even in the unlikely event that anyone could trace it back to the honeycombed residential warren at 1423-150 Cushing Sidewalk. Even now it could only remember a routine patrol against its prescribed transect. That was all it would remember, until a navigational malfunction sent it on a suicidal corkscrew into the no-go zone around Sudbury's main static field generator. There wouldn't be enough left afterwards to reconstruct so much as a lens cluster, let alone an event log. As for the bodies themselves, even the most superficial investigation would reveal telling indications of Trevor Sawyer's resentment over his forcible conscription into the Health Corps, and previously unsuspected family ties to the M&M regime recently risen to power in Ghana. Nobody would waste time asking questions after that. Those associated with the Madonna's New Order were notorious for their efforts in bringing down the old one. With Sawyer's hospital clearance and medical expertise, the damage he could have done to the law-abiding members of the community was incalculable. Sudbury was better off without him. Whether he'd been killed by his own, or whether some vigilant lawbreaker, near or far, had tracked him to his lair and terminated his terrorist activities with extreme prejudice. It wasn't as though these kind of surgical strikes didn't happen all the time, and if some lawbreaker was behind it, it was, by definition, all for the best. One more item checked off the to-do list. Desjardins wrapped Mandelbrot in his t-shirt and headed outside, cradling the bloody bundle against his bare chest. He was drowning in a vortex of emotion. He was empty inside. He tried to resolve the paradox as he ascended to ground level. Grief, of course, for the loss of a friend he'd had for almost 10 years. Satisfaction for the price exacted in return. And yet, he had hoped for more than this grim sense of a debt restored. He had hoped for something more fulfilling. Joy, perhaps, at the sight of Trevor Sawyer watching his wife and child burn alive.
Joy at the sight of Sawyer's own immolation, flesh crisping from the bones, eyeballs bursting like great gelatinous grubs boiled in their sockets, knowing even there at the end, feeling it all, he'd never even found the strength to whimper. Joy eluded Desjardins. Granted, he'd never felt it any of the other times he'd balanced the books, but he had hoped for more this time. Certainly, the cause had been more heartfelt. But still, only grief and satisfaction and something else, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He stepped outside. Pale morning light rose on all sides. Mandelbrot was growing cold and stiff in his arms. He took a few steps and turned to look up at his castle. It loomed huge and dark and ominous against the brightening sky. Before Rio, a small city's worth of would-be saviors had labored there. Now it was all his. Gratitude, he realized, astonished. That's what he felt. Gratitude for his own grief. He still loved. He could still feel with all his heart. Until this night and this loss, he had never been completely sure. Alice had been right all along. Sociopath was far too small a word to contain whatever it was he had become. Perhaps he'd go and tell her, once he'd laid beloved Mandelbrot to rest. On the one hand, kind of an extreme reaction. On the other hand, I totally get it. 100%. In the same position, I'm not entirely sure I'd do anything differently. Horribly enough. Assuming I was a chemically induced sociopath and had the power of God on my side, or in this case, resources to do literally anything I wanted, and not be judged accordingly. Yikes. If I'd known that one was in there, I'd definitely have gotten a warning up. Because I knew that was coming. I thought it was later on in the book, and I was kind of dreading it. Honestly, it's the death of the cat that gets me. Seriously, though, if you ever want to read the best pet obituaries, Peter Watts has you covered. Check out his blog. It's depressing when he does a pet obituary, but man, he does it justice. I wish I was talented. Shoot. Disarmor. Leave cadavers here only. Unauthorized disposal will be prosecuted. Enum at Xera Biohazard Statute 4023-A-25-sub 5. I'm not sure what at is. Enum at. It was a three-walled enclosure, open to the sky, south of the 184 just outside Ellsworth. The sign had been sprayed onto the inside of the rear wall. The smart paint cycled through a half-dozen languages, holding on each for a few seconds in turn. Clarke and Willette stood at the open side, looking in. The grated floor was crusted with old lime, cracked and scaling like a dried-up desert lake bed. It was obviously years since it had been replenished. 4 bodies lay on that substrate. One had been carefully set to rest with its arms folded across its chest. It was bloated and black, squirming with maggots beneath a nimbus of flies. The other 3 were desiccated and disarrayed, like clumps of leaves strewn about and abandoned by strong winds. Limbs and one head were missing. Willette gestured at the sign. They actually gave a damn back in the old days. People would end up in jail for burying their loved ones in the back rose garden, endangering the public health. She grunted, remembering.
They couldn't stop Behemoth. They couldn't stop the coat-tail plagues. But at least they could lock up some poor old woman who hadn't wanted to see her dead husband go up in flames. Clarke smiled faintly. People like to feel, what's the word? Proactive? Ouellette suggested. That's it. Ouellette nodded. To give them their due, though, it was a problem back then. There were a lot more bodies lying around. They were stacked up to your shoulder, even out here. For a while, cholera was killing more people than Behemoth. Clarke eyed the structure. Why stick it way out here? Ouellette shrugged. They had them everywhere. Clarke stepped into the enclosure. Ouellette put a restraining hand on her shoulder. You better stick with the older ones. There's no end to the things you could catch off that fresh one. Clarke shrugged off the hand. What about you? I'm broad-spectrumed up to here. There's not much that can get me. The doctor approached the cadaver from upwind, for all the good it did. The light breeze wasn't nearly enough to dispel the stench. Clarke, keeping the greater distance, fought the urge to gag and closed on her own assignment of body parts. She held out her can of Sterirap like a crucifix and pressed the stud. Excuse me, what is going on? Diaphragm didn't like the way I was breathing. So it was like, I'm going to reject this. Hiccup. I love a parade. Clarke, keeping the greater distance, fought the urge to gag and closed on her own assignment of body parts. She held out her can of Sterirap like a crucifix and pressed the stud. The wizened, one-legged body at her feet glistened as the aerosol laminate hardened on its surface. These are actually in pretty good shape, Ouellette remarked, spraying down her own corpse. Not so long ago, you had to check twice a week if you wanted to find a leg bone connected to a knee bone. Scavengers had a field day. She might be spraying it on thick, Clarke noted, without surprise. She was spraying it on thick, Clarke noted without surprise. She might be immune to whatever diseases festered in that body, but it still wasn't going to be any treat to carry it around. So what changed? Clarke asked. No more scavengers. Clarke rolled the mummified remains with her foot and sprayed down the other side. The wrap hardened in seconds. She scooped the shrouded body into her arms. It was like carrying a loose bundle of firewood. The Sterirap squeaked faintly against her dive skin. Just feed it into Miri, Ouellette told her, still spraying. I've already changed the settings. The MI's tongue stuck out to starboard. Crinkly silver foil lined its throat. Clarke set the remains on the pallet. The tongue began to retract as soon as the weight had settled. Miri swallowed and closed her mouth. Do I have to do anything? Clarke called. Nope, she knows the difference between a live body and a dead one. A deep, almost subsonic hum sounded briefly from within the MI. Ouellette dragged a humanoid cocoon from the compound. Its bloated features had vanished entirely under layers of fibrous plastic, as though Ouellette were some monstrous spider given to gift-wrapping prey. The surface of the shroud was peppered with the bodies of trapped insects, half embedded. They twitched, dying against their constraints. Clarke reached out to give Ouellette a hand. Something sloshed faintly as the weight shifted between them. Miri opened her mouth, empty again, and belched hot, dusty breath into Clarke's face. The tongue extended as though from some enormous, insatiable baby bird. Can your skin breathe in that thing? Ouellette asked over Miri's second helping. What, my dive skin? Your real skin. Can it breathe under all that copolymer? Copolymer is pretty much what I've worn for the past 5 years. Hasn't killed me yet. It can't be good for you, though. It was designed to keep you alive in the deep sea. I can't imagine it's healthy to wear it in an atmosphere all the time. Don't see why not, Clarke shrugged. It breathes, it thermoregulates, it keeps me nice and homeostatic. In water, Laurie. Air has completely different properties. If nothing else, I bet you've got a vitamin K deficiency. I'm fine, Clarke said neutrally. The MI hummed contentedly. If you say so, Ouellette said at last.
Miri gaped for more. They plotted their course by derelict road signs and inboard maps. Ouellette steadfastly refused to go online. Clarke had to wonder at the stops marked along their route. Belfast? Camden? Freeport? They'd barely been dots on a map even before the world ended. Tell that to anyone from Freeport, let me tell you. As someone who's been in the Maynard region, Freeport's kind of bustling. It's a bit of a tourist trap. Thanks, LL Bean. They'd barely been dots on a map, even before the world ended. Why not go to Bangor, just a few clicks to the north? That was where the people would be.
Not anymore, Ouellette said, raising her voice above a frenetic orchestral seesaw she'd attributed to some Russian maniac called Prokofiev. Why not? Cities are the graveyard of mankind. It had the ring of a quote. There was this threshold, I don't remember what it was exactly, some magic number of people per hectare. Any urban center was way up on the wrong side of it. Something like Behemoth set loose in a high-density urban area, not to mention all the ancillary pathogens that hitched a ride in its wake. It takes off like a brush fire. One person sneezes, a hundred get sick. Germs love crowds. But small towns were okay? Well, not okay, obviously, but things didn't spread as fast. The spread's still going on, actually. The towns were small and seasonal, and the areas in between were pretty much owned by the Whitecaps. Ouellette gestured at the withering foliage scrolling past the windshield. This was all privately owned. Rich old R's and K's who didn't mingle, had good medical. They're gone now, too, of course. Gone to Atlantis, Clarke surmised. Some of them, anyway. So the big cities had exactly two choices when Fire Witch came calling, Ouellette continued. They could either throw up the barricades and the static field generators, or they could implode. A lot of them couldn't afford generators, so they imploded by default. I haven't been to Bangor since '53. For all I know, they never even cleaned up the bodies.
They got their first live customers at Bucksport. They pulled off the main drag at about 2 a.m., next to a Red Cross Calvin cycler with a worrisome yellow telltale winking from its panel. Ouellette examined it by the light of an obsolete billboard, running on stored solar, that worked ceaselessly to sell them on the benefits of smart cloth and dietary proglottids.
Needs restocking.
She climbed back into Miri and called up a menu.
I thought they got everything they needed from the air, Clarke said. That's what photosynthesis was, after all.
She'd been amazed to discover how many complex molecules were nothing more than various combinations of nitrogen, carbon, and O2.
Not trace elements.
Ouellette grabbed a cellulose cartridge, its compartments filled with red and ochre paste, from the dispensing slot.
This one's low on iron and potassium.
The billboard was still hawking its non-existent wares the next morning when Clarke squeezed herself into Miri's toilet cubicle. When she came out again, two silhouettes were plastered against the windshield. She stepped carefully over Ouellette and climbed up between the bucket seats. Two Hindian boys, one maybe 6, the other verging on adolescence, stared in at her. She leaned forward and stared back. Two pairs of dark eyes widened in surprise. The younger boy emitted a tiny yelp. The next second, both had scampered away.
It's your eyes, Ouellette said behind her.
Clarke turned. The doctor was sitting up, hugging the back of the driver's seat from behind. She blinked, gummy-eyed in the morning light.
And the suit, she continued. Seriously, Laurie, you look like some cut-rate zombie in that getup.
She reached behind her and tapped the locker in the rear wall.
You could always borrow something of mine.
She was getting used to her alias. Ouellette's unsolicited advice was another matter. A half-dozen people were already lined up when they climbed out into daylight. Ouellette smiled at them as she strode around to the back of the vehicle and lifted the awning. Clarke followed, still sleepy. Miri's mouths opened as she passed. The throat's silver lining had withdrawn, exposing a grid of sensor heads studding the cylindrical wall behind. Icons and telltales flickered across the panel on Miri's backside. Ouellette played them with absent-minded expertise, her eyes on the accumulating patients.
Everybody's standing, nobody's bleeding, and no obvious cases of Behemoth. Good start.
Half a block behind the billboard, the two children Clarke had surprised pulled a middle-aged woman into sight around the corner of a long-defunct restaurant. She moved at her own pace, resisting her children as though they were eager dogs straining to slip the leash. Farther down the road, picking his way across scattered debris and asphalt-cracking clumps of grass, a man limped forward on a cane.
We just got here, Clarke murmured. Yep. I usually blast the music for a couple of minutes just to let people know, but a lot of the time it isn't even necessary.
Clarke panned the street. A dozen now, at least.
Somebody really spread the word. And that, Ouellette told her, is how we're going to win.
Bucksport was one of Ouellette's regular stops. The locals knew her, or at least knew of her. She knew them, and ministered unto them as she always had, her omnipresent music playing softly in the background. The sick and the injured passed like boluses of food through Miri's humming depths. Sometimes the passage would take only moments, and Ouellette would be waiting at the other side with a derm or injection, or some viral countervector to be snorted like an antique alkaloid. Other times the patients would linger inside while the M1 knitted their bone MI, not M1, while the MI knitted their bones back together, or spliced torn ligaments, or burned out malignancies with bursts of focused microwaves. Occasionally the problem was so obvious that Ouellette could diagnose it with a glance, and cure it with a shot and a word of advice. Clarke helped when she could, which was rarely. Miri maintained its own inventories, and Ouellette had little need of Clarke's limited expertise in fish bites. Ouellette taught her some basics on the fly and let her triage the lineup. Even that wasn't entirely successful. The rules were easy enough, but some of the younger ferals recoiled at Clarke's appearance. The strange black skin that seemed to ripple when you weren't quite looking. The little outcroppings of machinery from flesh. The glassy, featureless eyes that looked at you and didn't, that both looked at you and didn't. That belonged not so much to a human being as to some unconvincing robot imposter. Eventually, Clarke contented herself with the adults and gave them vital tips while they waited their turn. There was, after all, more to dispense than medical attention. Now there were instructions. Now there was a plan. Wait for the missiles, she told them. Watch the starbursts. Track the fragments as they fall. Find them on the ground. This is what you look for. This is what it is. Take whatever samples you can. Soil in mason jars, rags swept through, aerosol clouds at ground zero, anything. A teaspoonful might be enough. A tin can half full could be a windfall. Whatever you can get, however you can get it. Be fast. The lifters may be coming. Grab what you can and run. Get away from the impact zone. Hide from the flamethrowers any way you can. Tell others. Tell everyone. Spread the word and the method. But no radio. No networks. No fiber op. No wireless. The ether will fuck you up the ass if you let it. Trust only to the word of mouth. I'm going to remove mentally that it says to word of mouth. Trust only word of mouth.
Find us at Freeport or Rumford or places between. Come back to us. Bring us what you have. There may be hope. Augusta made her skin crawl, literally. They approached from the east just before midnight, along the 202. Taka took them off the main drag in favor of a gravel road a short ways down the gentle slope of the Kennebec River valley. They parked on a ridge that overlooked the shallow topography below. Everything this side of the river had been abandoned. Almost everything on the far side had been, too. The bright core that remained huddled amidst a diffuse spread of dark, empty ruins left over from the good old days. Its nimbus reflected off the cloud bank overhead, turned the whole tableau to grainy, high contrast black and white. Faint goose flesh rippled along Clarke's arms and nape. Even her dive skin seemed to be, well, shivering, a sensation so subtle it hovered on the threshold of imagination. "Feel that?" Willette said. Clarke nodded. "Static field generator. We're just on the outer edge of the field." "So it gets worse inside?" "Not right inside, of course. The field's directed outward. But yeah, the closer you get to the perimeter, the more your hair stands on end. Once you're inside, you don't feel it. Not that way, at least. There are other effects." "Like what?" "Tumors." Willette shrugged. "Better than the alternative, I guess." A cheek-to-jowl cluster of lights and architecture rose against the dark, its outlines suggesting the contours of a crude, pixelated dome. The new Augusta was obviously squeezing every cubic centimeter it could out of the safe zone. "We going in there?" Clarke asked. Willette shook her head. "They don't need us." "Can we go in there?" For all its lost stature, Augusta must still have portals into the pipe. Lubin might have been better off sticking with them after all. "You mean like shore leave? Stop by on our way through for some VR and a hot whirlpool?" The doctor laughed softly. "Doesn't work that way. They'd probably let us in if there were some kind of emergency, but everybody kind of sticks to their own these days. Miri's out of Boston." "So you could get into Boston. Even better." "It is kind of beautiful at night, though," Willette remarked, "for all of its carcinogenic properties. Almost like the Northern Lights." Clarke watched her without speaking. "Don't you think?" She decided not to push it. "Night looks pretty much like day to me, just not as much color." "Right. The eyes." Willette gave her a sideways look. "Don't you ever get tired of daylight all the time?" "Not really." "You should try taking them out now and then, just for a change. Sometimes when you see too much, you miss a lot." Clarke smiled. "You sound like a fortune cookie." Willette shrugged. "It wouldn't hurt your bedside manner, either. Patients might relate to you better without the affect, you know." "There's not much I can do for your patients, anyway." "Oh, that's not—" "And if there is," Clarke continued, her voice conspicuously neutral, "then they can accept my help without dictating my wardrobe." "Right," Willette said after a moment. "Sorry." They sat in silence for a while. Finally, Willette threw Miri back into gear and cued her music, an adrenaline discord of saxophone and electric percussion at serious odds with her usual tastes. "We're not stopping here?" Clarke asked. "Goosebumps keep me awake. Probably not all that good for Miri, either. I just thought you'd enjoy the view, is all." They headed farther along the road. The prickling of Clarke's skin faded in moments. Willette kept driving. The music segued into a spoken interlude with musical accompaniment. Some story about a hare who'd lost his spectacles, whatever those were. "What is this?" Clarke asked. "Twin-sen stuff. I can turn it off if you—" "No, that's fine." Willette killed it anyway. Miri drove on in silence. "We could stop any time," Clarke said after a few minutes. "A little farther. It's dangerous around the cities." "I thought we were past the field." "Not cancer. People. Olette tripped the autopilot and sat back in the bucket seat. They tend to hang around just outside the claves and get envious. Miri can't handle them? Miri can slice and dice them a dozen ways to Sunday. I'd just as soon avoid the confrontation. Clarke shook her head. I can't believe Augusta wouldn't have let us in. I told you, the claves keep to themselves. Then why even bother sending you out? If everyone up here is so bloody self-centered, why help out the wildlands in the first place? Olette snorted softly. Where have you been for the past 5 years? She held up her hand. Stupid question. We're not out here for altruism, Laurie. The MI fleet, the salt licks. Salt licks? Feeding stations. It's all just to keep the pharaohs from storming the barricades. If we bring them a few morsels, maybe they won't be quite so motivated to bring Behemoth into our own backyards. It made the usual sense, Clarke had to admit. And yet... No, they wouldn't send their best and brightest out for a lousy crowd control assignment. You got that right. Yeah, but you... Me? I'm the best and brightest? Olette slapped her forehead. What in the name of all that's living gave you that idea? I saw you work. You saw me take orders from a machine without screwing up too much. A few days' training, I could teach you to do as well for most of these cases. That's not what I meant. I've seen doctors in action before, Taka. You're different. You... One of Willette's own phrases popped into her head. Bedside manner. You care, she finished simply. Ah, Olette said. And then, looking straight ahead, don't confuse compassion with competence, Laurie. It's dangerous. Clarke studied her. Dangerous. That's a strange word to use. In my profession, competence doesn't kill people, Olette said. Compassion can. You killed someone? Hard to tell. That's the thing about incompetence. It's not nearly so clear-cut as deliberate malice. How many? Clarke asked. Olette looked at her. Are you keeping score? No, sorry. Clarke looked away. But if I was, she thought, I'd blow you out of the water. She knew it wasn't a fair comparison. One death, she supposed, could be a greater burden than 1,000, if it mattered enough to you, if you bothered to get involved, if you had compassion. Finally, they pulled into a remote clearing further up the slope. Olette folded down her palette and turned in with a few monosyllables. Clarke sat unmoving in her seat, watching the gray-on-gray clarity of the nightscape beyond the windshield. Gray meadow grasses, charcoal ranks of spindly conifer, scabby outcroppings of worn bedrock, overcast tissue paper sky. From behind, faint snores. She fished behind her seat and snagged her backpack. The ICAP vial had settled to the very bottom, a victim of chronic inattention. She held it in her hand for a long time before popping it open. Each ICAP covered the entire visible cornea, and then some. Suction tugged at her eyeballs as she pulled them off. They broke free with a soft popping sound. Ugh. It was as if her eyes, not just their coverings, had been pulled out. It was like going blind. It was like being in the deep sea, far from any light. It wasn't altogether unpleasant. At first there was nothing, anywhere. Irises grow lazy when photocollagen does all their heavy lifting. After a while, though, they remembered to dilate. A swath of dark gray brightened the void directly ahead, faint nocturnal light through the windshield. She felt her way out of the MI and leaned against its flank. She let the door hiss shut as softly as possible. The night air cooled her face and hands. Diffuse brightness registered at the cornea of her eye, fading every time she focused on it. Before long she could tell the sky from the tree line. Dim, roiling gray over serrated shadow. It seemed marginally brighter to the east. She wandered a few meters and looked back. Miri's smooth, startling edges almost glimmered against this fractal landscape. To the west, through a break in the cloud, she saw stars. She walked. She tripped over roots and holes half a dozen times for want of illumination. But the color scheme was pretty much the same as that served up by her eye caps, gray on black. The only difference was that contrast and brightness were cranked way down. When the sky began brightening to the east, she saw that she'd been climbing up a denuded gravelly hillside populated by stumps, an old clear-cut that had never recovered. It must have been like this long before Behemoth had arrived on the scene. "Everything's dying," she'd said. And Olette had replied, "That was happening anyway." Clarke looked down the way she'd come. Miri sat like a toy on the edge of what must have been an old logging road. Brown trees lined the far side of the road, and the hill she stood on to either side. They'd been razored away down the swath she'd just climbed. Suddenly she had a shadow. It stretched down the slope like the outline of a murdered giant. She turned. A fluorescent red sun was just cresting the hill. Ribbed clouds above glowed radioactive salmon. They reminded Clarke of wave-sculpted corrugations on a sandy seabed, but she couldn't ever remember seeing colors so intense. "Losing your sight every night might not be so bad," she reflected, "if this is how you get it back in the morning." The moment passed, of course. The sun had only a few degrees to work with, a narrow gap of clear, distant sky between the land below and the clouds overhead. Within a few minutes it had risen behind a thick bank of stratus, faded to a pale bright patch in an expanse of featureless gray. Alex, she thought. Olette would be up soon, steeling herself for another pointless day spent in the service of the greater good, making a difference that made no difference. Maybe not the greater good, Clarke thought. Maybe the greater need. She started down the hill. Olette was climbing into daylight by the time Clarke reached the road. She blinked against the gray morning, and blinked again when she saw the Rifter's naked eyes. "You said you could teach me," Clarke said. Stargazer. "She's okay, Dave," Taka said to her dead husband. "She's a bit scary at first. Chris would take one look at her and run out of the room. Definitely not much of a people person. But she's fine, Dave, really. And if you can't be here with me, at least she pulls her own weight." Miri drove down old I-95 through the ramshackle remains of a town called Freeport. It had died with the departure of the fish and the tourists, long before Behemoth had made everything so definitive. South of town, they pulled onto a side road that ended at a secluded cove. Taka was relieved to see that the scraggly woodlands above the high tide line were still mostly green. She cheered them on. "Why here, exactly?" Laurie wondered as they debarked. "Electric eel." Taka unlocked the charge cap on the side of the vehicle and took the socket in one hand. The cable unspooled behind her as she headed down slope. Cobble slipped and clattered beneath her feet. Laurie paced her to the water's edge. "What?" "On the bottom somewhere." Kneeling, Taka fished the hailer out of her windbreaker and slipped it into the water. "Hopefully the little bastard still comes when you call him." A small eruption of bubbles 20 meters offshore. A moment later the eels surfaced in their wake and squirmed toward them, orange and serpentine. It beached itself at Taka's feet, a giant fluorescent sperm with a tail trailing off into the depths. It even had fangs, a two-pronged metal mouth disfiguring the surface of the bulb. She plugged the cable into it. The bulb hummed. They stashed these things here and there, she explained, so we're not completely dependent on the lifters. Laurie eyed the calm water in the cove. Ballard stack? Caesar reactor.
You're kidding.
Taka shook her head. Self-contained, self-maintained, disposable. Basically, just a big block with a couple of radiator fins. Drop it into any open body of water, and it's good to go. It doesn't even have any controls. It automatically matches voltage to whatever the line draws.
Laurie whistled.
Taka scooped up a flat stone and skipped it across the water. So when's Ken going to show up?
Depends.
On what?
On whether he got into Portland.
And then, after a curious hesitation,
And whether he ditched us back at Penobscot. He didn't, Ken said. They turned. He was standing behind them.
Hi.
Laurie's face didn't change, but some subtle tension seemed to ebb from her body.
How'd it go?
He shook his head.
It was almost as if the past 2 weeks hadn't happened. Ken reappeared, as ominous and indecipherable as ever. And just like that, Laurie faded away. It was a subtle transition, some slight hardening of the way she held herself, a small flattening of affect. But to Taka, the change was as clear as a slap in the face. The woman she had come to know as an ally and even a friend submerged before her eyes. In its place stood that humanoid cipher who had first confronted her on the slopes of a guttering wasteland 14 days before. Ken and Laurie conversed a little ways down the beach while Miri recharged. Taka couldn't hear what they said, but doubtless Ken was reporting on his Portland expedition. Debriefing, Taka thought, watching them. For Ken, that word seemed to fit. And the trip had not gone well, judging by the body language and the look on his face. Then again, he always looks like that, she reminded herself. She tried to imagine what it might take to wipe away that chronic deadpan expression and replace it with something approaching a real emotion. Maybe you'd have to threaten his life. Maybe a fart in an elevator would do it. They headed back into town once Miri was sated. Lubin crouched in the space between the bucket seats, the women on either side. Taka got the sense of gigabytes passing between the other two, although they spoke perhaps a half dozen words each. Freeport was another regular stop on the trap line. Taka pulled up at a parking lot off Main and Howard, beside the gashed facade of a defunct clothing store called, she always smiled at it, The Gap. The town as a whole, like most of them, was long dead. Individual cells still lingered on in the rotting corpus, though, and some were already waiting when Miri arrived. Taka blared Stravinsky for a few minutes, anyway, just to spread the word. Others appeared over time, emerging from the shells of buildings and the leaky hulls of old fishing boats kept afloat in some insane hope that the witch might be afraid of water. She and Laurie got to work. Ken stayed out of sight near the back of the cab. Shadows and dynamic tinting of Miri's windows rendered him all but invisible from the outside. Taka asked about Portland over an assembly line of broken arms and rotting flesh. Laurie shrugged, pleasant but distant. He could have got in all right, just not without getting noticed. No surprise there. A scorched zone surrounded Portland's landside perimeter, a flat, sensor-riddled expanse across which Taka couldn't imagine anyone crossing undetected. An enervated, membranous skin guarded the seaward approaches. You couldn't just sneak into the place, into any clave for that matter, and Ken evidently lacked the resources to break in by force. Every now and then Taka would glance absently at the windshield as she moved among her patients. Sometimes she caught sight of two faint, glimmering pinpoints looking back, motionless and unblinking behind the dark reflections. She didn't know what he might be doing in there. She didn't ask. It was as if night were a black film laid over the world, and the stars mere pinpricks through which daylight passed.
There, Ken said, pointing.
Fine needles, 3 or 4 of them. Their tips etched the film high in the west, left faint scratches across boots. They faded in seconds. Taka would never have seen them on her own. "You're sure we're safe?" she said. He was a silhouette, black on black against the stars to her left.
"They're past us already,"
he told her, which was not the same thing. "There go the intercepts," Lorry said behind them. Brief novae flared near Hercules. Not contrails, but the ignition of anti-missile salvos dropped from orbit. They'd be below the horizon by the time they hit atmosphere. It was after midnight. They were standing on a rocky hill south of Freeport. Almost everything was stars and sky. The insignificant circle of Earth below the horizon was black and featureless. They'd come here following the beeping of Ken's handpad, linked to a periscope floating somewhere on the ocean behind them. Evidently their submarine, Phocina, Lorry had called it, was a stargazer. Taka could see why. The Milky Way was so beautiful it hurt. "Maybe this is it," she murmured. It was unlikely, she knew. This was only the second attack since they'd put their plan into motion, and how far could the word have spread by now? And yet, 3 attacks in as many weeks. At that rate, they had to get lucky before too long.
"Don't count on it," Ken said.
She glanced at him and glanced away. Not so long ago, this man had stood at her back, one hand clamped easily on her neck, instructing Lorry in the disassembly of weapon systems that Taka could barely even name. He had been pleasant enough, then and since, because Taka had cooperated. He had been polite because she'd never stood in his way. But Ken was on a mission, and Taka's little experiment in grassroots salvation didn't seem to factor into it. He was playing along with her for some indecipherable reason of his own. There was no guarantee that tomorrow, or the next day, he wouldn't run out of patience and go back to his original game plan. Taka didn't know what that was, although she gathered it had something to do with helping Ken and Lorry's waterlogged kindred. She had learned not to waste time pressing either of them for details. It had involved getting into the Portland clave, which evidently Ken had not been able to do on his own. It had also involved hijacking Taka's MI, which he had. Now she was alone with 2 empty-eyed ciphers in the dead of night and the middle of nowhere. Beneath the intermittent camaraderie, the humanitarian pitching in, and all the best-laid plans, one fact remained unassailable. She was a prisoner. She'd been a prisoner for weeks. How could I have forgotten that? She wondered, and answered her own question. Because they hadn't hurt her. Yet. They hadn't threatened her. Lately. Neither of her captors seemed to indulge in violence for its own sake. Hereabouts, that was the very pinnacle of civilized behavior. She had simply forgotten to feel endangered. Which was pretty stupid when you got right down to it. After the failure at Portland, there was every chance that Lubin would revert to Plan A and take her vehicle. Lorry might or might not go along with that. Taka hoped that some bond remained beneath that cool, reinstated facade, but that might not make much difference either way. And there was no telling what either of them would do if Taka tried to get in their way, or if they ran out of more efficient alternatives. At the very best, she could be stranded in the middle of the wildlands, an immunized angel with clipped wings, and no Miri to back her up the next time some red-eyed man came looking for salvation.
"I'm getting a signal from Montreal," Ken said. "Encrypted. I'm guessing it's a scramble."
"Lifters?" Lorry suggested. Ken grunted an affirmative. Taka cleared her throat. "I'll be back in a sec. I have to take a wicked pee." "I'll come with you," Laura said immediately. "Don't be silly." Taka waved downhill into the darkness, where the peak they occupied emerged from threadbare woodlands. "It's only a few meters. I can find my way." Two starlit silhouettes turned and regarded her without a word. Taka swallowed and took a step downhill. Ken and Lori didn't move. Another step. Another. Her foot came down on a rock. She wobbled momentarily. Her captors turned back to their tactics and machinery. Taka moved carefully downhill. Starlight limned the bare outlines of obstacles in her path. A moon would have been nice, though. She tripped twice before the tree line rose before her, a ragged black band engulfing the stars. As it engulfed Taka herself a few moments later. She looked back up the hill through a black mesh of scrub and tree trunks. Ken and Lori stood still at the top of the hill. Still stood at the top of the hill, motionless black cutouts against the sky. Taka couldn't tell whether they could see her, or even whether they were looking in her direction. She'd be plainly visible to them if she was standing out in the open. Fortunately, not even their night creature eyes could penetrate tree trunks. She had a few minutes at most before they realized she was gone. She moved as quickly as she could without raising a racket. Thankfully, there wasn't much undergrowth. In better days, the sunlight filtered through the canopy had been too sparse, and more recently, sunlight was hardly the limiting factor. Taka felt her way blindly through a maze of vertical shafts and leaf litter and thin soil rotten with behemoth. Low branches clawed at her face. Gnarled old tree trunks resolved from the darkness barely a meter ahead. Young spindly ones jumped out at her with even less warning. A root caught her foot. She toppled, biting back a cry. One outstretched hand came down hard on a fallen branch. The sound it made, snapping, echoed like a gunshot. She lay twisted on the ground, nursing her scraped palm, straining to hear any sounds from up the slope. Nothing. She kept going. The slope was steeper now, more treacherous. The trees that sprang up in her path were only skeletons, dry and brittle and eager to betray her with the firecracker report of every snapped twig and broken branch. One of them caught her just below the knee. She pitched forward, hit the ground, and couldn't stop. She tumbled down the slope, rocks and tree fall stabbing her in passing. The ground disappeared. Suddenly she could almost see. A broad, dim swath of gray rushed toward her. She recognized it in the instant before it struck her, peeling skin from her forearm. The road. It ran around this side of the hill like a hemline. Miri was parked somewhere along its length. Taka got to her feet and looked around. She'd had no way to plot her course down the hill, no way of knowing exactly where on the road she'd landed. She guessed and turned right and ran. The road was clear, thank God, its dim gravel albedo just enough to keep her oriented and on track. It unspooled gently around the shoulder of the hill, shattered stone crunching beneath her feet, and suddenly something glinted in the darkness ahead, something straight-edged and shiny under the stars. Oh, thank God! Yes, yes! She yanked open the driver's side door and piled inside, panting, and hesitated. What are you going to do, Tack? Run out on everything you've been trying to do for the past 2 weeks? Just drive away and let the witch take over, even though there may be a way to stop it? Sooner or later, someone's going to strike gold, and this is where you've told them to bring it. What happens when they show up and you've run off with your tail between your legs? Are you going to call for help? You think it would come before Ken and Lori had their way with you? Or just hopped into that submarine of theirs and disappeared back into the Mariana Trench? Do you think it would come at all these days? And what about tipping off the enemy, Tack? What about whoever or whatever is trying to stop the very thing you're trying to help along? Are you going to risk all that just because of something two borderline personalities with funny eyes might do if you got them angry? Taka shook her head. This was insane. She had a few precious moments before Ken and Lori tracked her down. What she decided in that interval might decide the fate of New England, of North America even. She couldn't afford to be hasty, but there was no time. I need time. I just need to get away for a while. I need to work this out. She reached out and thumbed the ignition pad. Miri stayed dark. She tried again. Nothing. Nothing but the memory of Ken lurking in this very cab, eyes aglitter, surrounded by all that circuitry he seemed to know so much about. She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, he was staring in at her. Ken opened her door. "Anything wrong?" he asked. Taka sighed. Her abrasions oozed and stung in the silence. Lori opened the passenger door and climbed in. "Let's head back," she said, almost gently. Why are—" "Go on," Ken said, gesturing at the dashboard. Taka put her thumb on the pad. Miri hummed instantly to life. She stepped out of the cab to let Lubin enter. Overhead, the heavens were crammed with stars. "Oh, David," she thought, "how I wish you were here." And with that, I will call it. We will continue this next week, as per the usual. And yeah, hope people are digging it. Sorry about the scene of Cat being brutalized, but by what? Who knows? We'll find out later. We will indeed find out later. That which got the Mandelbrot, the bratwurst. Poor Mandelbrot. Mandelbrot did nothing wrong, other than be the best cat. Or just a typical cat, which is very rapidly approaching best. Anyway, with that, I got a dip. As always, I do this every Friday on Free Read Fridays, where I read short stories and indeed entire novels aloud. What came before was Behemoth Book 2, Seppuku, by Peter Watts, the last installment of the Rifters trilogy. Rifters Singular trilogy. Whatever. Anyway, I have a link in the stream description on the YouTube for where you can read the book on your own time for free, courtesy of the author. It's a reason I want to get around to doing some Cory Doctorow, because Cory Doctorow is legit. Like, that is a real person. He is, wow, like, words fail to describe what Cory Doctorow is all about. He's pretty great. I'm a fan. I do want to read some of his work on stream. I've been meaning to get around to it, but I haven't yet. Anyway, I'm gonna dip. Hope people enjoyed. If you didn't enjoy, I'm sorry. If you did enjoy, I'm sorry. Either way, I apologize. And with that, I'll go. Stay safe, stay sane, stay toasty or cool as per your preference, and be decent to each other. Bye. See you all later. Bye-bye.